everyone, welcome to CBR Saga, Spider-Man's favorite show on the internet. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about one of the most genuine friendships in the MCU, and then we're going to totally rip it apart. That's right, today we're discussing Peter Parker and Ned Leeds, and how the future for Ned might be a little goblin-y. Is Ned destined to become the Hobgoblin in some way, shape, or form? Could this best friend and man in the chair become Peter's arch nemesis? We think it could happen. Join us as we break down this heartbreaking story option, and you can decide if it will happen or not. Let's get started. I'm joined today by my co-host and good friend Nick. Nick, how you doing today?
Doing good, Jacoby. Thank you once again for having me back. Very excited to be here.
Happy to have you. So, okay, I got a big question to ask you. A very important question.
Okay.
If your best friend suddenly turned into your arch nemesis, biggest villain, how would that make you feel on the inside?
Oh, I mean, geez, you're breaking my heart. I guess I would say that while I would not condone their choices and their actions, I would. They are still my best friend. I would wish them well in their future endeavors while trying to kick their butt.
Their future evil endeavors, basically. It's like, you can do your thing. I'm going to stop you, but good luck. I wish you well.
Yeah.
Maybe some of that mindset is going to carry over to the characters that we're talking about today, because we are talking about BFFs, Peter Parker and Ned Leeds. The peanut butter and jelly, salt and pepper, other things that go together. They are just a team. These two. They started off in the MCU as best friends. Fortunately, we didn't get a drawn-out thing of Peter trying to hide his identity from Ned. Ned found out pretty early on, and from there, they transitioned into a partnership where Ned very clearly stated he wanted to be the man in the chair for Peter, and he has helped him out a lot. And I think overall, that's been a very interesting relationship in the MCU, because you don't get that a whole lot. So, what do you think about their relationship overall?
I mean, I love their relationship, and you're right. We really didn't have anything like it before this point, because we had friendships. We had Cap and Bucky, we had Tony and Rhodey, but those were like adult friendships. And it's interesting, too, because they didn't need to do, they could have gone the Harry Osborn route, they could have gone another route, but they chose this really interesting character, sort of gave him a different spin, and now they've built it up so well to the point where, just think of that moment in Endgame when, Peter obviously comes back from being snapped, and then things are sort of winding down, and you see Peter back in high school, and him and Ned see each other for the first time. That's one of those moments that brings the feels that you didn't really think it would, and it's because that relationship was built up so well.
I agree with that, and I like what you said at the beginning there, because we've seen, Tony and Rhodey, and we've seen Captain and Bucky, and the problem with those is that they became heroes. Rhodey became War Machine, and Bucky became the Winter Soldier, and 90s grunge rock musician. So it's really interesting that they always go that route, and I like that at least for a bit we got to see a little bit of a superhero and his civilian friend navigating that, and their relationship has been a keystone. And now, by saying that, let's talk about how we can break that all down, because basically we're in interesting territory here with the character of Ned Leeds. I think ever since Ned Leeds was first announced as Peter's best friend, it kind of raised a few eyebrows, because Ned Leeds as his best friend isn't as well known, as you said, as someone like Harry Osborn. The goblins have been done to death in a lot of Spider-Man movies, so they needed to move away from that in a really organic way and enter Ned Leeds, who was just this really genuine, heartfelt character. But the longer this character spends in the MCU, the more you got to question, is he destined for something more? Is he destined to suit up not for the side of good, but for the side of evil? And could he become the Hobgoblin? Do you like the Hobgoblin as a villain? What are your thoughts about the Hobgoblin?
I do, because I really do like the Hobgoblin, because, we had the Green Goblin for a while, and some people would say it's derivative, but it actually is a sort of a nice switch up between the Green Goblin, which we have gotten once, twice, 3 times, so many times. And it's cool because it's taking something we know, in the tech, in the look, and it's giving it sort of a fresh feel. So I really do like the Hobgoblin as a villain. Bringing him into the MCU might prove difficult, especially since Ned Leeds isn't the first Hobgoblin, isn't the origin of Hobgoblin. But, the MCU has changed a lot of stuff in terms of origins and things and characters we know. And we've liked when they've done that before, so I don't see why they couldn't do it again.
Sure, there's absolute faith that they'll be able to adapt this character fully, because I think the whole goblin mythology is such an important part to Spider-Man's just character overall, that it would be interesting for the MCU to sidestep the origins of Norman Osborn and Harry Osborn and go straight to the Hobgoblin, which is more of an after effect of the Goblin. And I think that actually creates a very interesting story idea that there is this some type of goblin technology out there. And if the Hobgoblin's creation first leads to more Norman Osborn and Harry Osborn as like these big bad architects, of the MCU, as Norman Osborn as this legitimate threat to not just Spider-Man, but to everyone overall who's working from the shadows. I think that's a great way to go with the character and to switch things up, especially if his first move, his first introduction is by affecting someone like Ned, someone who is so good-hearted and someone so genuine and such a good friend to Peter, and turning him to the dark side. Then that immediately creates this level of anger between Peter and the guy who did this to his best friend, just Ned, which I think is just an interesting way to go with the character overall. Let's talk about ways that Ned could become the Hobgoblin, and let's get the tough one out of the way first. And in a word, it's jealousy. It would be a very tough sell, I think, to do this, to go this route. But I think it would be a very honest, very mature way to take this relationship. For so long, these two have been together. These two have been side by side. And as they're growing into their adulthood lives, they're kind of separating a little bit. Spider-Man Far From Home played with that concept that there was this hint of jealousy between Ned and MJ because of MJ's now part of their group. And, Ned was like, I've known longer, it's like, this is my role. And they had that fun bickering, and that was fun in that movie. But what if that leads to something more? And that warps my mindset a little bit there. Do you think Ned could go down a jealous path? Do you think there's a jealous bone in Ned's body?
I do. And you brought up a really good example of it in terms of MJ coming in. But there's even been sort of Easter eggs laid before that. Remember when in Spider-Man Homecoming, when Peter is first telling Ned about his powers because Ned catches him, and Ned even, it's played off as a joke, but Ned even sort of says like, oh, is that spider there? Like, could it bite me? Like, I mean, even if it hurt, I would still let it bite me. And it's played off as a joke, but given the context that now Ned might become, a supervillain, an enemy of Peter Parker, you look on that moment a little differently and think, okay, maybe he really was sort of, the jealousy started really, really early. And then you're right, MJ comes into the picture and Ned's like, well, like I knew first, and it's played off as a joke, but putting those moments in this different context really makes them make sense. They're the kind of moments that once people see Ned as Hobgoblin, they'll go back and rewatch the MCU and see those moments and think, oh my gosh, why didn't we sort of see this coming? So yes, I think there's definitely a jealous bone in Ned's body. I haven't been convinced yet that there is such a point of jealousy that Ned would betray Peter, do something evil just to overcome that jealousy. I don't think he's that evil yet, but I think there are ways to either bring that out of him or even like put that into him. And what I'm sort of talking about first is Ned's a genius. He's sort of played off as this joke character, but like he goes to that same genius high school as Peter Parker. He helped Peter bypass Tony Stark's suit, and he was his guy in the chair. Like, Ned is a smart person. So just picture a world where Ned says, I want to help Peter. In my jealousy of not being able to sort of help Peter, like Peter can do things better than I can, I'm going to create this serum, this formula that maybe gives me enhanced abilities, which is actually very congruent to the Hobgoblin and the Green Goblin. And then maybe this serum warps his mind a little bit to where that little bit of jealousy that we've seen from Ned so far turns into dangerous jealousy and warps his mind to where he thinks wrong is right and right is wrong. And I think that's a really interesting way to sort of turn Ned against Peter.
I love that example so much. I think having Ned create the serum out of a sense of just like, okay, I'm going to initially start to help Peter is a very interesting way to start the goblin process, because there was two ways in my mind to play it, and I actually think your way was better. My way was Oscorp does create this goblin serum, and Ned gets a hold of it and decides to take it to do everything we just talked about to kind of help Peter, but then it turns him bad. I actually like your way more, because what your way does is has Ned have agency of create this and show off his genius side, and then the after effects of that is Oscorp getting a hold of Ned's twisted goblin serum and then using that to introduce more of Norman Osborn and the Osborns and Green Goblin. And I think what yours does better than my thought was just puts Ned front and center of all of it and shows just how talented he is and how dangerous that is to the character. So I like that. I like that a lot.
Well, thank you. I also like the idea of starting with Norman Osborn, and because that's sort of the origin of Ned Leeds as the Hobgoblin, if I'm remembering correctly, is he's sort of used at first and framed for being the Hobgoblin, and then eventually he becomes it. So that way is also very feasible for Norman Osborn to have created this serum. He does some crime, needs someone to blame it on, somehow bumps into Ned, who he learns is maybe Spider-Man's friend, or Spider-Man's even guy in the chair, and finds a way to sort of pin it on him, because we forget that in this universe now, people know who Spider-Man is. None of Spider-Man's friends, family, are sort of safe from the villains of the world.
I agree with that. I think that would be a great way to show the consequences of Far From Home's cliffhanger, is by actually, showing that the people around him are kind of in danger, because that is a part of Spider-Man's character that I think the MCU has kind of missed out on, is the fact that he has to keep his secret identity and live this tough life because of the people around him are like seriously endangered. And I hate to say it, but I want Spider-Man to suffer more in the MCU because that is such a vital part of his character. I always liked Spider-Man a lot as a character growing up, because he wasn't, Superman, he wasn't Batman, he wasn't all these people. He was a guy struggling to pay his bills. It's a struggle for life of not being with the woman he loved right away, having failed relationships, and being estranged from his friends because he kept having to ditch them and not share with them his true self. And I think that's an element that's missing from the character, and there's a good reason for that, because that's really dark for the MCU. But I would still like that for a character, and I think a good compromise for that is by compromising Ned, and because then it shows the true consequences of this superhero life that Peter has to live. And then as he goes about becoming a full-on superhero in his adulthood, he will fully understand the weight of what a secret identity means, and the people that he's lost along the way. And Ned might be a casualty for that. I'd be heartbroken, but actually, if they go that route, that might be a little better.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and you're very right. We have sort of missed that element of tragedy from this version of Peter Parker. Because when Spider-Man was introduced to the MCU, they sort of said, okay, we can't do the same origin story we've done 3 times. Like, people have seen it before. So this sounds terrible, but we missed out on Uncle Ben's death. We didn't get to see Uncle Ben's death. We missed out on Gwen Stacy's death. These are moments that have impacted the character in movies and comics before. The closest thing we've sort of had is Iron Man dying. Right. However, I've always sort of felt that Peter Parker's Avengers life and Peter Parker's personal life have been kept very far apart. In terms of large scale, Spider-Man's really only been involved with things with the Avengers and with Iron Man, and so those parts of his life have felt different. I think a way to combine them is to do this with Ned. Turning him against Peter, sort of giving him what this situation that Captain America had to go through for so long, only making it a little more different because Ned actually knows what he's doing, and Ned is actually on the opposite side of Peter.
Yeah. I think you bring up excellent points. It just breaks my heart to say all those things, because I want these two just to be BFFs forever and for Peter to live a happy life, but I guess that's so opposite of what I guess Spider-Man normally is as a character. So we've kind of talked about different ways that this Ned Leeds can become the Hobgoblin and kind of become Peter's enemy and set up some very interesting conflict. But there is another option out there that could do what I think the MCU does best, is like have its cake and eat it too, of be able to maintain the status quo of both Peter and Ned being friends, but also having a Ned Leeds version of the Hobgoblin. And the only way for that is obviously the multiverse. As we've talked about before, and a lot of people have talked about before, is like the multiverse is going to be a huge part of the MCU going forward. We're going to see the seeds in Phase 4, and then it's going to be a major player in Phase 5 and probably Phase 6 and beyond. Like the multiverse is the thing. We know that Doctor Strange is going to be in Spider-Man's sequel. We know that Electro's coming back, which implies that Spider-Man is taking a trip to the multiverse. And if Peter's hopping worlds and the world that he goes to, if in the Sonyverse itself, the version of Hobgoblin is Ned Leeds, that would be interesting, because then Peter would be up against an enemy that he thinks he knows, because he thinks he knows Ned, and he would try to save him, would try to help him, would try to see the good in him. But if this version of Ned Leeds that's in a different universe is just completely evil to its core, how does Peter fight against something like that? Would Peter stick to his guns and do what he did with the Vulture and, try to see the good in him and save him no matter what, or realize that his friend's lost? How do you think Peter would respond to a different multiverse Ned Leeds?
Well, I think this multiverse concept is so interesting that the MCU is set up, because you can essentially give us villains, give us characters, without having to show us any of their backstory. You can give us a villain and say, hey, you missed their backstory, it happened in a different universe. For Peter Parker, this Peter Parker that we know, to show up in a different universe and come across Ned Leeds as the Hobgoblin, you have to think that in that universe, something happened where Ned and Peter were either never friends or they were friends for a while and there was a major divide in their relationship. All that still happened, but this Peter hasn't experienced it. So it's really interesting to see that Peter knows Ned as a certain way, but this Ned he will be going up against knows a different Peter a certain way. So it's also interesting to think of that from that sort of point of view, that mirror concept point of view, because the question is going to be, can Peter separate his feelings from the Ned he knows versus the Ned that's in front of him? And I love this concept for all characters. Like, I'm so excited for characters to venture into other universes and see versions of characters that they've come to know and how they're going to deal with it.
I agree with that. I think that opens up a whole avenue of different storytelling options, and first and foremost keeps it on the character level. It's not just interesting to see these different versions of characters, it's interesting to see how the characters we've come to know and love respond to these different versions of characters. And that's where you're going to get your really dramatic heft, like that's going to get the really good storytelling options to see this different variety of characters that we're familiar with that are slightly different, and see how our characters, our OGs, respond. Now I'm so torn between which version of Ned Leeds as the Hobgoblin that I want to see. Because overall, what this conversation has totally enforced in me, I want to see Ned Leeds as the Hobgoblin. I want to see him in a glider, in a scary, yellowish, Halloweenish mask, flying around and causing trouble for Peter. I'm just not sure which version I want to see, because I think all options really create fascinating story avenues for the future. Which, out of all of them, which one would you prefer?
Well, I will say that that multiverse option we sort of talked about, there's already precedence in the MCU for it. Look at Gamora. Gamora is a different universe version of herself living in this current universe. I'm really excited to see where that story goes, but she doesn't even know Peter anymore. Like, that's the relationship I'm talking about. You saw it briefly during the final battle in Endgame, but Peter's like, I thought I lost you, and Gamora's like, I don't even know you. Yeah. So that's the interesting kind of dynamic and relationships I'm excited to see. So I think the multiverse option is the one that is best set up right now, especially if they're going to be doing elements of Spider-Verse. I've heard talk that other Spider-Men are going to be in it. But if you're asking me right now, I really like the idea of taking Jacob Batalon's Ned Leeds, as we know him, and playing up the fact that he has spent all this time by Peter's side. Maybe Peter neglects him a little bit, or maybe Peter, spends more time with MJ, and it leads Ned to a path where he wants to better himself. He doesn't feel useful to Peter anymore because maybe MJ's his guy in the chair now, or gal in the chair, whatever the technical term is. And now Ned feels like he needs to better himself, and so he shows us how smart of a character he is, and he creates the goblin formula. He creates his, and from that he creates his own weapons, or maybe he finds some leftover Stark weapons that he turns into his own weapons. I know the multiverse is being set up, but I'm just really interested to see, because if we see a multiverse Ned Leeds, we don't really know what happened to the old Ned Leeds. Like, he probably gets pushed to the side, but that character's been set up in a way I like, and I want to see him go further. Yeah,
I agree with that, because Ned Leeds in the multiverse as a Hobgoblin is like a fun Easter egg, basically, right? It's like a fun, oh, look, it's fun. It's a nod to his comic origins. While if our Ned Leeds turns into the Hobgoblin and gets set on this path of any of the ways in which we discussed, it's a sadder option for sure, and it's a tougher option. But I think it's the better option, because then that creates long-term consequences for Spider-Man the character, and just overall will shine a really interesting new dynamic to Peter and Ned's relationship. So even though the multiverse is cool, and I think maybe if there's a way for it to do both, maybe there's a version of the multiverse where we see an early version of Ned Leeds as Hobgoblin in the multiverse, right? Like, he's like the evil version, and then it kind of shows how closely these universes are intertwined with each other, that Ned Leeds is kind of set on a path like to become the Hobgoblin in a similar way. Then maybe that's an interesting idea to play with if we have a lot of time with the character. But overall, yeah, I think our Ned Leeds should become the Hobgoblin.
I do, and I like that pitch a lot. Like, you could have Spider-Man see briefly what Ned could become, and then go back to his own universe and take steps to avoid it. And what's the famous saying? What's the famous saying from I think it's Master Oogway in Kung Fu Panda? It's one often meets their destiny on the road they take to avoid it. So Peter could be taking these steps to be like, hey, Ned, don't turn evil, and actually pushes Ned in his own universe to become the Hobgoblin.
Thank you for quoting Kung Fu Panda, and yeah, and also it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It's like this, and then that shows the very tragic nature of everything that we're trying to do. I think I'm convinced. Do you have any other final thoughts about the Hobgoblin?
No, I'm excited. Like I said, there's so many other aspects to the Hobgoblin. Ned Leeds isn't the only Hobgoblin. I think it'd be interesting to maybe introduce another character who was the first one, and then maybe we get a cliffhanger at the end of Spider-Man 3 of Ned sort of finding the serum and things like that. I think there's so many different ways it can go. But I'm just really excited because Jacob Batalon, I think, is a really good actor. And I think he's played Ned in such a way that sort of made us fall in love with him. And I think the best test for him now would be to make us fall out of love with him and hate ourselves for it. This all sounds like very depressing stuff, but I couldn't be more excited for it.
Exactly. It's what are we doing to ourselves? It's like we want to be sad at these movies. No, I agree with you. Jacob Batalon is very talented, and I'm excited to see where his character goes. But I'm going to turn it over to you guys, the audience. We've discussed a lot of different ways that Ned can become the Hobgoblin. Which one is your favorite? Do you want to see our Ned become Hobgoblin, or do you just want to stick to a normal, different version multiverse of the Hobgoblin, or something else? Please let us know down in the comments below, and thank you all so much for listening to another exciting episode of CBR Saga. I would like to thank Nick very much for joining me, and we will see you all next time. Thank you very much.